From Finger Lakes PRISM. I'm not sure I'm going to get it right, the Terrestrial Invasive Outreach Coordinator?
It's actually changed. I'm now the Terrestrial Invasive Species Coordinator.
Alright.
It's the Terrestrial guy.
Well, I'll have you come up and answer questions as we have them. I can see if I can turn. There.
Yeah, so.
Well, I have a lot of questions.
I'd be happy to give you a lot of answers.
Just from the film, what happens to those water chestnuts that people collect on those 100 and some bags? Can they compost them? What do they do with them?
We usually don't compost them. We usually just throw them and take them to the dump.
And what happens to the dump?
They're in the trash bags, and if they're not in water for an extended period of time, they dry out. It's an aquatic plant, so it's just going to die. The seeds aren't going to be viable anymore. So it's pretty straightforward with water chestnuts. It's a lot harder with other plants.
Are not viable after a certain amount of time.
Yeah, so you give it just like a few weeks, couple months, and again, it's an aquatic plant, so like even though they're invasive, that they're super adaptable, they can't adapt to not being in water, right? They're an
So
aquatic
you're
plant.
basically composting them.
No, because you don't want to compost them because they could theoretically survive on that.
So, what do you end up doing with them? In a plastic bag in the dump?
Yeah, that's what we gotta do, unfortunately. It's not a great solution, but it's really the only effective
And in the
solution.
end, the world will be full of plastic bags full of rotting little.
Yeah. Well, and I know that is actually, you asked about that particular, the aquatic plant, but that's sort of the same protocol for the terrestrial invasive.
Oh yeah, it's way worse with like terrestrial invasive plants, like Japanese knotweed in particular. Like if you even just have tiny pieces of the Japanese knotweed, let's say you come in and you mow it up, you go to compost it. Well then like those little bits of pieces, like they'll just start growing out of the compost.
What do you do?
So like again, you have to you could burn it or you could take it to the dump. Like those are your options. And like it's not pretty, but like that's it. That's all you got. Like
The black swallow one is the example of it. You don't want to compost it because you just have.
yeah, it's just gonna come right back.
I know, but unless you burn it, it seems to me it still can come back to life.
What are they doing with the big, giant hogweeds?
Yeah, so hogweed, they have a very aggressive program that New York State runs. They run specifically the giant hogweed control program that's on its own. It's just people who go out and field teams just control giant hogweed. They've done a really great job at limiting the spread and controlling populations of giant hogweed where they are. Not sure where their end goal is, if it's just going to be eradication or control, but if you look at the area that giant hogweed has infested over time, it's dramatically shrunk. We've done a really good job of controlling the populations where they have been. We've eradicated them from a lot of sites throughout the state.
What's done with those giant hogweeds?
So
Are
usually,
they bagged too?
usually they're sprayed with pesticides.
There was an infestation for several years up here, I'm blanking on the road, but it was up just sort of the top of a hill between the two ridges. I was mentioning to Matt, every time I would see it, I would call that outline and say, it's still here, it's still here. Because it was getting out of control for a while there, but they seem to have gotten, I haven't seen any this year, so hopefully it's gone.
Marion, this year, for the first time on the roadsides, I've seen where we used to have the ditch lilies.
Oh, yeah.
It looked like hogweed, but it wasn't giant.
No, it's the
Oh,
wild
parsnip.
parsnip, yeah, parsnip.
Okay,
But that actually has that same photosensitive quality. But it's
Yeah, so
not as badly as giant.
but
there-
still, it's there in a way that I've never
I
seen.
know,
before.
yeah, I was going to ask about it.
yeah, so there's quite a few species giant hogweed is closely related to. They all look the same. They're
Right.
very hard to tell apart. So there's giant hogweed. There's cow parsnip, which basically just looks like a giant hogweed that's like maybe my height down to my hip. There's wild parsnip, which is yellow flowers. There's Queen Anne's lace. There's wild carrot. There's poison hemlock. They all look the same. They're all non-native. And so, yeah, populations you might be seeing, it could be cow parsnip or it could be Queen Anne's lace. But basically, they all sort of have the same effects on our ecosystem. So they're often growing in open areas, like along roadsides. And they don't have as bad of effects.
No.
Giant hogweed's the worst. Like giant hogweed's a really, really bad one. But cow parsnip and Queen Anne's lace and poison hemlock are still toxic in some doses. If you're someone who is particularly sensitive to like skin problems, and you might have some issues there. And they're all toxic to ingest as well, right? So poison hemlock, that's famously what Socrates had to drink when he was sentenced to death. So
Queen Anne's lace has never seemed to be toxic, but it's still part of.
They're all different species, so it's all varying levels of toxicity. So something like Queen Anne's lace might not be as toxic as something like poison hemlock or giant hogweed, but they're all on a spectrum.
Very interesting.
I get a sense that a lot of the road crews, though, are avoiding cutting it because they're afraid of being exposed, because you're out there with a
Sure, I mean,
brush hog.
it would be really vulnerable.
Yeah, I don't know, because I'm not seeing so much just economic too. I suppose they don't have the money to be able to mow the roadsides like they used to. But if you're not knocking it down in any way, I don't know how you're going to get it under control.
I have no idea, I wondered.
They're all going to seed right now. So.
I know, and it just happened, I mean.
Yeah, it's really within the last 5 years, yeah.
Yeah, and with invasive species too, most of them, especially like our terrestrial invasive plants, it's not just as simple as like cutting down a tree, pulling it in. It's you got to put in a lot of effort because if you just remove the above ground material, usually their root systems are vigorous enough that they're just going to keep sending up new shoots. So you can cut down the Phragmites growing along, the thruway all you want. You can cut down the knotweed that's growing along, like our local highways all you want. But it's gonna be back in like 3 weeks. So like, what's the point?
They're not getting rid of it.
It's tough. It's really tough.
A few years ago, I had in my garden, I had a lily leaf beetle. Are you aware of that?
I don't think so.
Really nasty, and I had to dig up all my Asiatic and Oriental lilies. Fortunately, the bay lilies are not affected by it, but they're not nice at all. At the moment, my big question is about jumping worms.
Oh yeah, we're getting a lot of questions about jumping worms.
Yes. So what do you know about? I know how to deal with them when I see them. I carry with me a little bucket with about an inch of water and a squirt of dish detergent.
Okay, yeah.
Drop them in. But that doesn't get rid of them.
No, so
And it gets rid of those.
yeah, so jumping worms, it's a very depressing invasive species to talk about because in jumping worms, really the best way to deal with them is just preventing them from spreading in the first place,
Right.
which is really hard to do because their eggs can be all over the soil once they're infesting an area. You just walk through, a couple of eggs get like on your shoe, you go home, and now there's a new population there. A lot of plant nurseries might inadvertently be spreading jumping worms if they have it in the mulch that they sell. We've gotten some reports about that. Some people specifically reach out to me, like the Rochester Museum and Science Center. There were a bunch of volunteers there this summer that were spreading some mulch, just like trying to help the property and manage it. And they realized after they had already spread it that the mulch was infested with Asian jumping worms. It's a really big problem, Asian jumping worms. And when they can get into an area, they can cause a lot of damage. Problem is, once they get there, it's how do you get rid of the worm? And we don't really have any good answers for that. There's no biocontrols. You can't really use like pesticides or anything because they're underground. So it really depends. If it's a really small population, you catch it like as soon as they get there. You could get water mixed with mustard. If you pour that over the soil, it forces them all to go to the top. It does work, and it actually works really well.
I have an enormous garden. The idea of getting enough mustard in the to cover my entire garden. What I have noticed is that when we have dry season, they seem to be gone.
Yep.
And I thought, wonderful, it was a mirage, and the next season was wet, and there they are, like 1,000.
Yeah, so they're worms, right? So they need a lot of moisture to survive, but it's not necessarily that they disappeared, when it was drier. It's just maybe they were less active. They were probably burrowing a lot deeper than they normally would to get to the water that's deeper in the soil. And those eggs can survive in conditions for a pretty long time. So they're just ready to pop back up, when it gets wet again. So if you're talking about like a larger area, I really wish I could offer more advice in terms of actions on what you can do. But for really any invasive species that I usually talk about, I have a lot of things I can say, like, hey, do this, look at this, consider this. Asian jumping worms, like once they're there, it's kind of it. And it's tough to get rid of worms, like how do you do it? You don't
I understand they're really damaging to soil quality too because of the way they interact with it. I mean, that's sort of alarming too. It's one thing to have them, they're an irritation, but when they're really damaging the soil.
Yeah, and worms in general are very problematic for our soils here in upstate New York because, glaciers came in, 10,000 years ago. They basically bulldozed everything that was lived, all of our soil fauna. And once the glaciers retreated, we have worms that are native to North America, even a few that are native to New York City. Very, very few. Most of our worms, North America live down south, and there hasn't been enough time between the end of the Ice Age and now for those native worms to move their way back up. So pretty much all of our worms are non-native species.
I know, I keep being told that by my master gardener plants, but the fact is that in the past, our worms have been considered helpful because they help loosen the soil.
Yeah, so if I could just interrupt right there. So most of our worms here for the past few decades, centuries or so, those have been European earthworms, and they're great for your garden, right? Like they're great for speeding up the process of decomposition, making those nutrients available to plants you might be growing, like nice little vegetables and flowers and your lilies and stuff like that. That's great. And the idea that worms aren't good for your garden, that's just wrong. Worms are great for your garden. All of your garden plants have evolved with worms. But the difference is our forests have it, our native ecosystems have it. So when the worms in your garden, whether they're European worms or Asian jumping worms, once they get out there, our natural forest ecosystems have evolved to have a much slower rate of decomposition than what you would expect in your garden. So when worms get in there, they're really speeding up that nutrient cycling. They'll often eat the roots of a lot of the plants that are growing in the forest. So a lot of these more rare understory plants, once worms get in there, whether it's European or Asian jumping worms, they start disappearing off the landscape. And so they're great for your garden. And the advice you've been told in the past that worms are great for your garden, it's totally true. But once they escape into the wild, it's a very different story because our forest ecosystems are just not adapted for that. And they're speeding up the composition so much that it's really affecting a lot of our other soil fauna and the plants that are living in that soil. So.
Are any of our native predators who have adapted over time to eat the European worms, guadums and what have you, I understand they don't really like the Asian jumping worms because their behavior is so different.
Yeah, their behavior is quite different.
But is there any sign that they're sort of, well, at least I can eat it? The behavior's not like I can eat it.
Yeah, not that I know of. I'm not, that'd be an interesting study, and I haven't heard anything about that, whether there are predators that are going after the Asian jumping worms. You'll often see, with any invasive species, there's always going to be a couple of random incidents of a predator, feeding on them. For spotted lanternfly, for instance, it's not that nothing eats them. Every once in a while, you'll find a picture online of a praying mantis catching a spotted lanternfly, or a big spider eating them. But you know, same thing with like the jumping worms. It's like maybe you'll see like a starling, you know, every once in a while, but like it's never enough to actually control their population. Just very incidental. It's
Yeah.
not, you know, population scale control.
So, another question I had about the jumping worms. Do robins eat them? Do they like them?
Well, I guess a lot of it's the behavior, because when you grab, they act like snakes almost.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that the birds are just kind of freaked out by it. So, I don't know that it's a taste issue. I think it's more of a behavioral issue, and they don't like how they don't just
Do we
lay there
know?
like a worm. They behave differently.
I don't think fish like them.
I-
That's been
I
shown.
wondered about the bait fish, the bait worms. Are those? I actually stopped at a bait shop and bought some to see if they are the same as the jumping worms. But of course, they were refrigerated, so they didn't know any jumping at all. So I have no idea.
But usually a bait worm's like a red worm, I think,
Right.
not even the big ones like what we think of as a garden worm, which I think of as
Yeah.
a red worm.
Yeah,
Usually it's a
the
red worm.
things that kids used to call night crawlers, which were always big.
Well, yeah, that's
regular
right,
worms.
yeah,
They were
yeah.
jumping worms. You didn't jump.
No, they don't, yeah, they were pretty tame.
Anyway, so I still don't know if the robins eat the jumping worms.
Well, I guess we'll see.
Yeah, it often takes a while, right, for like native predators to adapt to, you know, a new species. Because yeah, like just like, you know, what Marion was saying, you know, it's something they've never seen before, and the behavior could just really confuse them. You know, if you've been eating, you know, salad all your life, and then all of a sudden, you know, you go to take a bite of it, and the salad just like explodes out of the bowl, right? Like you'd be really confused too, you know. So it takes some time to sort of adapt to those things, right?
Right. The thing I noticed in my garden, I haven't really noticed that the plants have been damaged until just a few weeks ago. I've been working on a nice even stand of myrtle, Finger Lakes, what they call it. And there would be these spots where it was dead, and the rain came and it didn't revive them, so I pulled them up. And this summer I really never saw more than a handful of the jumping worms because it was so dry. But now, this past week, or past 2 weeks, I found these dead periwinkle plants, and as I dug them up, there was one of the jumping worms in there. It's the first time I've seen where there's cause and effect, at least a correlation of the dead plant with the worm. I have them all over the place.
Yeah.
But this was the first time I noticed them dead. And otherwise they're disagreeable. I gather they are just damaging the soil itself.
Yeah, so they could be damaging the soil and changing the nutrient composition there that might be not in periwinkle's favor. And like I said before, they could also just be eating like the literal roots of the periwinkle itself. It's actually fascinating that you're seeing the periwinkle die out, because periwinkle itself is an invasive species. They usually do really well. And you know, no matter what conditions you throw at them, so that's actually really interesting.
Exactly. Right. So anyway, I wanted some other wisdom besides covering my entire garden. And you know how big my garden is, Marion.
I do.
Spreading it all with mustard is not something that I'm likely to do. What was this idea with the mustard?
So the mustard, when you pour it on the soil, it just really irritates the worms, and so they all come to the surface. And then you know you could pour like a gallon over like an area like this, and like 50 like jumping worms all come up. And he wants to come up, you just pick them all, throw them in the garbage or do whatever you want to do with them.
Don't put them in garbage.
And then,
Bucket
there
of
you go.
water with detergent.
Sure.
And they dissolve.
Yeah, however you want to dispose of them, however you want to murder all these worms, be my guest, but that's the idea.
Do you have a sense of what the concentration should be to really,
It's-
obviously the more the worse, but
Yeah, it doesn't,
to be reasonable in terms of the quantity?
doesn't need to be anything crazy, maybe like, say like the max would have to be like half and half. You really wanted to go crazy, but like, probably like 4 parts to 1, for water, I would say.
It's just bizarre. A few years ago, the first year, I really noticed that fall, and the lawn hadn't been mowed until it was kind of long, and so I had to rake the grass clippings. And each pass of the rake, this is in the fall, wet grass, and there were a couple every time. So it didn't require mustard and whatnot. It was water that brought them up. It was really amazing. Just the wetness did it. Mustard. I mean, the idea of my garden covered with mustard.
I wonder if the mustard plant, though, I wonder if you, blended down the mustard plant. Well,
Maybe grind up the wild parsnip along the roadside.
I think it would.
No, I don't think that's a good idea.
I think it's a very good idea at all.
Yeah.
Seeds, I would move from worms to,
Yeah, dermatitis. Yeah.
I was surprised at the part of the movie that talked about the purple blue stripe
Yeah.
being controlled
It's
because
back. Yeah.
it's coming back.
It's
Yeah,
coming back.
so about the purple blue stripe, it's definitely coming back this year. So the reason as to why we actually think that is because the biocontrol program for purple blue stripe was so successful. So we released 4 species of beetles back in the 90s, I believe.
Right.
The feed on the purple blue stripe. Some of them feed on the leaves, some of them feed on the roots. And we think the reason why they're popping up now is because they've done such a good job at eliminating all the purple blue stripe, and because these beetles, it's all they eat. Well, once all the purple blue stripe's gone, well then there's nothing left for the beetles to eat, so now the beetle population dies out. But there will be, some purple blue stripes will survive somewhere that the beetles didn't get to, and so now with the beetle population very low, the purple blue stripe's just bouncing back. But the good thing is we have a solution. We just release more beetles. We can just raise them in a lab and just release them, willy-nilly wherever we want.
Release the Kraken.
Yeah, which is what we've been doing a lot more this year. And so there's been a big explosion of purple blue stripe right now, but it should only be a temporary rise. Usually when you're looking at any population of any species in general, it's never just like a flat line, right? Like it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. And the idea is it's roughly staying at the same, consistent line over time. That's just what we're seeing with purple blue stripe now. It was down, now it just comes back up, and then we just release some more beetles, and just go back down again.
What about the milfoil?
So Eurasian water milfoil, that's a different story, because we don't have a biocontrol for Eurasian water milfoil. It's very difficult to get rid of. It's in all of the Finger Lakes except for, I believe, Sknialis. I think they're the only lake that treats their milfoil. That's really hard to remove. Really, any of your aquatic plants are really, really hard to remove because they can often just survive on fragments. So
Right.
you pull it up and just a tiny piece of it falls off, goes, a mile down the lake, and now you got a whole new population next to it. So
Hydrilla.
yeah, hydrilla is even worse. And so with Eurasian water milfoil, it's just kind of here. There's not a lot of management being looked at right now. Because usually with invasive species management, they were talking about invasive species curve before. And when an invasive species infests a huge, huge area, the cost of just removing that invasive species, tracking all of its separate populations, the amount of time and money you would need is substantial, and that's often time and money that we don't have in the invasive species management world. So stuff like Eurasian water milfoil, not really looking at it because it's everywhere, and the amount of time and energy for us to get rid of it, hundreds of millions of dollars, most likely. Versus something like hydrilla, which is another invasive plant, but is only found in a few scattered populations on Finger Lake. There's actually one right off the shore, right over here. And it's not any of the other Finger Lakes so far, or in Lake Ontario, knock on wood. And so that's something that we are putting a lot more of our effort into, because it might cost hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe even billions, to get rid of all the Eurasian water milfoil. But something like hydrilla, which only has a few scattered populations, we could actually get rid of that. We could actually stop that from becoming the next Eurasian water milfoil. So the invasive species world, we tend not to focus a lot of our attention and efforts towards the very widespread invasive species, because it sounds like a broken record at this point, you get the point, but we usually focus on those emerging invasive species, those with small populations that have the potential to become larger, because we just hate to add even more invasive species to what we're dealing with already. So that's just the most effective way. It's where you get the best bang for your buck in terms of time and money that you're putting towards management of this. So kind of went into a lot more there, but I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yep.
In the film, it emphasized boats.
Yeah.
I'm not a boat person.
Yeah.
But as I looked at the suggestion of cleaning it, it seemed to me, again, what happens to the stuff you're cleaning off? That wasn't.
Yeah, so with the aquatic plants, usually if you go to like most boat launchers, there will be like a little wooden box in the corner, probably 100 or a couple hundred feet or so from the actual water. And all of the invasive aquatic plants, you can just throw right in there, because they're aquatic plants, they're adaptable, but they're not going to survive just being on land. And so you can just throw them in there and they'll just die, and that's it. They're not going to come back.
They're not going to the seeds aren't going back into.
Yeah, they're not going back in. The plants have no chance just being dried out in the sun. So usually when we are wiping down our boats, there'll almost always be like a little station like that you just throw your stuff into.
So I think the reason for it too isn't really, worrying about it coming out of the lake and going on the land. It's more that many boaters go between water bodies.
Yes.
Right.
So it would be taking from one lake a live plant, putting it back, carrying it from your boat into another water body and spreading it that way.
I would think that rather than wiping the bottom of your canoe would be more.
I think, we're always in the same water body with your canoe.
But even if you're going to different spots on the same water body, right?
Well,
Like hydrilla is a great example. It's right outside here. It's right down by Ithaca and a couple of other spots on the eastern shore of Finger Lake. But if you go, it's like the western side, and you have hydrilla on your boat, now you just start a new population on the other side of the lake, right? So even within a water body, if it's an emerging invasive species, it can still be troublesome.
Right. Yeah.
So they started to address that. We were talking before the film started about the spotted lanternfly, and we talked about how many species it can feed on and how devastating it was to the grape industry in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, especially. And I don't know that we've heard that it's around here yet in our grape growing areas. But I wanted to have you kind of articulate for the rest of the folks here why you're not as concerned about some of the other, because it can feed on maples, it can feed on some other things. But kind of tell them why grapes might be an exception, but why it might not be as damaging as there was some concern about for some of the tree species, because I guess it likes maples too.
Yeah, so invasive species in general, right? Talk about the very beginning of the movie. There's a few ways you can define invasive species, but it's really any species that's causing negative impacts to the environment, to the economy, or to human health, right? So something like giant hogweed, that's clearly the human health side of things. And typically we don't see giant hogweed causing ecological problems. Spotted lanternflies like the same way. A lot of the species we've been talking about so far, those are really ecological problems. Maybe there's sort of knock-on effects that are also economic, but there's some species that are primarily economic pests versus being ecological pests. Spotted lanternfly is one of those. So Huge part of my job is just trying to tell people about spotted lanternfly right now. We're running a whole campaign about SLF. It's a really huge concern for us. And, you know, invasive species in general, and the documentary didn't really mention this, but invasive species, one thing that's very common really amongst all of them is that they're really good at taking advantage of disturbance, ecological disturbance. So what I mean by that is like areas that have been changed in some way. So typically, you know, ecological disturbance, we're talking about something like, you know, like a hurricane comes through and it knocks out a bunch of trees, creates new space for new plants to grow. That's typically, you know, what we think about with ecological disturbance. Well, you know, with humans and how we've changed this planet so dramatically, you know, you just look at, you know, the college campus here. Well, this, you know, probably used to be all forest, maybe it was a meadow, but now it's this, you know, all these lawns everywhere. And these new environments that we've created are places where invasive species tend to really thrive. So we often find invasive species in their highest densities where humans are in their highest densities. So, like, I live in Rochester, way more invasive species in the parks surrounding Rochester than there are in places like the Adirondacks, where it's almost entirely native species out there, right? So spotted lanternfly is one of those species that tends to do really well where humans are. So they typically spread on human vehicles. So they typically arrive in places that are very densely inhabited by humans. So for instance, our 3 populations of spotted lanternfly in the Finger Lakes region are in Syracuse, are in Ithaca, and in Binghamton. So even though they're coming up north from Pennsylvania, they're skipping over all of these more rural counties, and they're going right where there's more dense urban counties, right? So they've skipped over Cortland County from Binghamton right to Syracuse. So they've got both of those, but they've skipped over more rural county in between, right? So typically, things like spotted lanternfly, they do really well in cities, and we have so many tree species for them. They love to feed on, commonly grow in cities. Really any kind of fruit tree, walnuts, maples, tree of heaven, they're all there in abundance for them. And so we often find spotted lanternfly doing really well in agricultural settings, in cities, but we typically don't find them growing, escaping into the wild, in really deep, intact, healthy native ecosystems. Typically don't see them out there. Now, that could change. Maybe spotted lanternfly comes through, and it destroys all of our vineyards, and it's like, all right, what's next? And it starts heading for the woods to feed on some sugar maples. We don't know. It's only been here for 8 years. There's a lot that we don't know about spotted lanternfly, but what we do know right now is that they typically congregate around urban areas. If you actually look at the range of spotted lanternfly, like you see this pop up in even greater detail. So like, you imagine like a map. You'll see like, Pennsylvania, and then you'll see a little dot where spotted lanternfly is found in Cleveland. It skipped over, all these more rural areas, but it's in Cleveland. And you can see it's down in, like Richmond, Virginia, and some places down in North Carolina. So typically it just likes to live in urban areas because it thrives off of disturbance. It loves this environment of constant change. That's where it typically tends to succeed. So.
What's its natural predator in its native territory?
So there's a variety of different, insect pests and diseases as well. The thing about spotted lanternfly is that it is actually slightly poisonous. Not in any way that like we as humans would need to be concerned, but if you are, a larger insect trying to eat spotted lanternfly, then that's going to be a problem for you.
So none of them want to eat it either.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you'll eat the Asian jumping ones.
But maybe that would have. Well, you think of the monarch butterfly, it's distasteful
Yeah.
to birds.
Absolutely.
But because we love that, we applaud it.
Yeah.
As a spotted lanternfly is less lovable.
Yeah, and then like something like spotted lanternfly and monarch butterfly is a great example because monarch butterflies, it's like, yeah, maybe they're poisonous to birds, but they only feed on one plant species. That's it, right? It's just milkweed. So their population is basically tied to whatever milkweed's population is. Milkweed's been going down, so monarch butterflies have been going down. But something like spotted lanternfly feeds on over 70 different plant species. So like the grapevines die and it's fine. It's gonna go feed on the maple trees. The maple trees die, it's fine. It's gonna go feed on the walnuts. So like it always has something else to feed on, which
but
is
the monarch doesn't damage milkweed either.
yeah. And so like these are
Damage it.
yeah. And so like it does damage it, but when we're looking at it was talking about in the documentary these ecological relationships. And, monarch butterflies and milkweeds have co-evolved with each other, basically since forever, right? Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, these two species evolved with each other, right? So monarch butterfly maybe, adapts to the toxins that milkweed creates, but maybe milkweed starts creating some more stronger toxins, or maybe it creates some different toxins that monarch butterfly isn't evolved to. And so it's a constant arms race between the two, versus you introduce something like spotted lanternfly, and there's no resistance, right? It has all of the advantages. It's, it could eat anything, and there are no poisons in any of these trees that, can kill spotted lanternfly. And so it's just gonna run amok, right? There's no natural controls on this. It's not in balance in any way. That's really what we're worried about, right? With all of these invasive species. Doesn't matter what you name. These are just species where there's no balance, no natural checks and balances keeping their populations in any sort of reasonable level of control.
Well, on that somber note, I just want to say thanks to Matt.
Yeah.
I know you've got handouts, you've actually got some, I don't know, some interesting show and tell here.
Specimens too. Yeah, so if you guys want to take a look,
Yeah,
be my guest.
absolutely.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming tonight. Appreciate it.
Well, I want to say thank you to both of you for having this, and I'm sorry more didn't take
Yeah,
advantage
me too,
of this.
but it happens.
But it was very good.
I thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to end too, it's not all doom and gloom with invasive species. It gets very depressing. Like, believe me, I know.
I mean,
With invasive species, just like thinking about them and like, oh my God, there's so many of them. What are we gonna do? But there's tons of work that normal people can do to help stop spotted lanternfly or any other invasive species. So like spotted lanternfly, like just on its own, most of the populations that have been found in New York State have been found just by normal people. We're just like on the lookout, and they just knew what they were looking for. They helped us stop the spread of it way faster than it otherwise would have been. Species like hydrilla are the same story, and oftentimes just regular people knew what they were looking for to find invasive species before I did, right? So we were talking about the PRISMs before. I work for the Finger Lakes PRISM. I am the only person who covers the 17 counties of the Finger Lakes PRISM on land. I am the only person who does that. I have to do it all by myself. I can't be everywhere at once. I can't keep track of all these different invasive species. So you guys can absolutely help us. We know what you're looking for. You help us track invasive species and find them, and it's worked so well. Great example, actually, we have a volunteer program where we train people how to identify different common and emerging invasive species and how to track for them, when they go out hiking. There is someone who worked at a plant nursery in Rochester, and she found invasive mile a minute. This is invasive vine species taking over parts of Lake Connecticut right now, but it's really not in New York. And because she was a volunteer with us, she found actually they had a shipment of a plant from a nursery in Connecticut, native plant growing in this pot, but mile a minute had like somehow gotten in there, and because she was a volunteer with us, she was literally able to kill that mile a minute plant before it was able to escape. She literally stopped an entire invasion just by herself. Just find out one plant right before it was able to get out of its wild, before it was able to reproduce. She literally stopped it all by herself, and she was just a regular person, who just knew what she was looking for. So there's tons of positive stories out there too. Don't want to leave on like a super
Sorry,
yeah. So just know that as you.
I did jumping with but I can't prevent them. I'm waiting to hear how to prevent them, other than cutting right 2/3 of a
So it
garden.
seems to me, we were talking about, some of these things do go in cycles.
Yeah.
It seems to me garlic mustard